Hello and welcome to the Full Stack Capabilities webinar hosted by Embarcadero. Today we're going to take a look at three products, Aqua Data Studio, RAD Studio, and Sencha Ext JS, and we'll explore the roles that each of these products might play in developing a data-driven web application. Before we get started, I'd like to point out that for quality purposes with regards to our recording, all of the microphones except that of the presenter are muted, but you can still go ahead and ask questions. There's a Q&A panel typically on the right-hand side of your screen. If you put your questions in there, we'll try and get them answered by the end of the webinar for you. This webinar is being recorded, as I said, for the Embarcadero YouTube channel. With three products to look at today, there are three of us presenting. First up, we'll have Devon Gallagher. He's a senior sales engineer with Aquafold, 20 years worth of experience in database solutions, and he's going to demonstrate the Aqua Data Studio product for us. Then I myself, Craig Chapman, I'm a software consultant with Embarcadero. I have 23 plus years of experience with RAD Studio's product set, and so I'll be demonstrating RAD Studio and RAD Server. And then we have Ron Bailey, training director with Sencha. He's been with Sencha for 4 years and has 4 years experience with the Ext JS platform. He's going to demonstrate how we can use Sencha Ext JS to build our web front end. So what we'll be doing today is building a hypothetical online ordering system. We'll start with Devon introducing us to Aqua Data Studio, a powerful IDE for databases, which is going to enable us to design, create, and visualize the database for our application, in this case an ER database, entity relational database, for the online ordering portal. Then I'm going to open up RAD Studio and show you how we can take that data and convert it into a REST endpoint to be hosted in RAD Server. And then finally, Ron will show us how to use Sencha's Ext JS to consume that REST endpoint and provide a web front end for our online portal. Licenses for the Aqua Data Studio, RAD Server, and Ext JS products are now included with your purchase of the Architect Edition of RAD Studio, Delphi, or C++ Builder. Okay, so let's go ahead and hand over to Devon, who's going to introduce us to Aqua Data Studio.
Welcome to an introduction to Aqua Data Studio, which is now included in the Architect editions of RAD Studio, Delphi, and C++ Builder. Aqua Data Studio is a database IDE that has been on the market for many years, up to a version 19.0, was introduced in the early 2000s, and now up to 19.0, about to release version 19.5. There's flexibility in terms of the user interface for Aqua Data Studio, so we'll introduce some of the pop-out or dockable windows and then some of the other benefits here for developers building databases and tables with their application environments. The list of databases supported by Aqua Data Studio is quite extensive, and they continue to add new platforms. There are over 40 different database platforms supported by Aqua Data Studio. It's a Java tool, so it installs in different environments and has the flexibility of where you like to work. Okay, so to introduce the user interface, under Help About, again, you can see the link to the community site. But if I expand some of the pop-out or dockable windows I have set up here, on the left-hand side, you can see the database navigation tree, and we'll talk about how to populate and connect to the different databases. And then you can have that as a dockable or pop-out window on the left or right-hand side, as you might expect. On the right, I have customized my Object Explorer to my file system and even version control systems. So you have that type of flexibility with some of the dockable or pop-out windows in Aqua Data Studio. Then there is tabs within the user application, and then also standalone windows or floating windows. And so we'll dive into the user interface here and then introduce some of these popular features for working with data and databases and tables that you might expect in a mature IDE like Aqua Data Studio. Okay, to get started, you click on the first icon or server, register server, and you can see the extensive list of database platforms supported by Aqua Data Studio. So you point to the database platform and then populate the connection information on the right-hand side. So you can see an alphabetical list of where Aqua Data Studio can connect currently. I also like to point out Excel in this list, where you can take advantage of your Excel data sets and some of the data features in Aqua Data Studio. And then, of course, you have flexibility or different customizations, color coding, naming of your connections, even grouping or duplications of those connections. Okay, and then, of course, when you connect, you have the ability to explore, navigate, as you might expect in an Explorer-type view. So here are an example of some tables I've created in a RAD Studio database, so we'll step through how easy that is. And for the sake of this full-stack demonstration, you'll start to recognize some of these type objects or tables and ways of working with those. So, of course, there's right-click features that are encouraged to explore, from, say, creating a database in a user interface. So here, if I right-click, I have a Create Database graphical user interface where I can easily define that database and click Create. If I was at the table level, I could right-click, and there's my Create Table object editor, create tables, and step through defining those tables and structure. And then the query analyzer is where you have the ability to execute SQL, or if you have any DDL scripts or DML scripts, you could execute those directly in the query analyzer. So you have the flexibility to work in graphical user interfaces or through some of the scripting and SQL editor windows that some of us might be familiar with, or ultimately some of the visual windows as well. And so when we talk about querying the data, you have the easy drag and drop query builder where I can drag tables and execute SQL and bring back my result sets. If I create objects through more of a design interface, you have the ER modeling capability, or the ability to reverse engineer and create objects and then generate scripts and deploy those scripts, or have the DDL through a model file or an ER diagram file. So you have that type of flexibility. And then in terms of working with, say, data, you have different ways of moving data in or out of the database through the tools, import, export. Or one of the exciting areas for data-focused users is the visual analytics, where you have the data visualization capability within Aqua Data Studio as well. But for the sake of today's full-stack demonstration, let's just focus on how to dive in and work with tables and execute SQL and bring back some data sets or clone or migrate objects to different environments. So here, if I just opened up a query analyzer, I could easily just start typing SQL if I was familiar enough with how to execute SQL and bring back result sets just by typing SQL and some of the execution arrows that you might expect. So the query main menu can be expanded, where you'll see the different definitions of the green execution arrows, from parse to execute, one or multiple. Then other popular features for formatting code or digging into SQL history. So those type of features you might expect in, say, the query main menu. But let's dive in. Let's maybe create a database and then create some tables in different ways. So if I just opened up a query analyzer against a certain database connection, or here if I select a MySQL environment and then open up a query analyzer, here I could easily just execute a statement to create a database, right? So if I'm familiar enough with create statements, I could say create a schema, and for the sake of this demonstration, we're going to create a database in MySQL called DB ordering. So I could easily just issue that statement and execute that, and that would create a database for me. If I refresh my navigation tree here, you can see that database has been created for me, and I would be able to see that in my navigation tree. So here, drill into that database, I'd see my objects or tables there, right? So in terms of creating tables or bringing tables into an environment, as I mentioned, you could right-click on the Table Explorer. Right now, I don't have any tables in this new database, but if I right-clicked, here would be a Create Table editor, where I could start defining the structure of this table and then click on the Create button. Another way to do that could be through the modeling utility, right? So ER Modeler New, this would allow me to point to an environment. Maybe I'll stay with the MySQL example here. And this would allow me to say drag and drop a table, start defining the structure of that table. So here are two different ways to create a table, through the ER Modeler or through the graphical user interface. Or you could even export or introduce a DDL script very easily just by right-clicking, open up a query analyzer. And here, for example, I have a DDL script for creating those tables that I can explore, take a look at. Here's a parse that would parse through the create for those tables. And then if I wanted to execute that and create these tables in a certain database, I could choose that platform. Here I'll choose this DB ordering database that I just created, and then execute the create script here to create these objects in that environment. Click on the green run arrow. I'll see my output on the bottom portion of the screen, and then I can actually drill into these environments here. Again, if I just refresh my connection, let's see those new objects created and have the ability to navigate into those and explore those tables that I created, right? So if I wanted to perhaps look at those in a diagram, I could right click, and there I have some drill down capabilities to say diagram these tables or show the relationships in an entity relationship picture view. So here I could choose those tables and explore those by reverse engineering and see those in a diagram. So again, just different ways of seeing these tables here in the navigation tree, here in an ER diagram. And then again, if I wanted to say insert data into these tables, if I had my insert statements, I could open up those. Here I could step through the tools import data, which would allow me to step through importing data from different file formats. Or in this example, let me just open up my insert statement script, and then again I'd have the ability to choose the database I'm inserting these to, parse through that, and then execute. So in this case, here are thousands of lines of insert statements that I can quickly execute to populate data into those tables in the database that I had created. So very easy, familiar to use features that many of us might be familiar with in terms of creating or cloning objects. There's other advanced features that are worth exploring in, say, the tools menu or some of the right-click areas in terms of migrating objects with the schema script generator, doing comparisons between different environments with the compare tools drill down. So these are very popular features that are fully available in Aqua Data Studio and the Architect Editions licenses that Aqua Data Studio is now included in. Okay, so now we've opened up some different query analyzers, we've executed some statements, we've inserted some data. Let's dive into some of the other features here. So if I just started typing SQL, of course I could start querying these existing tables and confirming the data sets that are there, and then I could execute either an individual statement or multiple statements. So if I just started maybe executing SQL against multiple environments, you see some options there in terms of executing one or multiple statements, right? So here I could execute all or execute individual, and then I'd have the ability to bring back individual or multiple result sets. Here I could take action on this data. I can move this into Excel, or say I right-click here, save results, and you have the ability to extract data in different ways you might expect, delimited files, insert statements, migrate that to Excel. Here, if I maybe was less familiar with typing SQL and I wanted to take advantage of the Query Builder new would open up a new Query Builder, and then I could point to the database environment that I'd like to drag and drop tables against and build SQL against. So here, if I just drill into that DB ordering table, I would see the selection ability for those tables. I could drag over an individual table and then execute a select star against that table very easily. Or if I had multiple tables or wanted to bring over tables with referential integrity, you'll see the join line, and then you'd have the ability to execute SQL against multiple tables or even individually select fields, right? If I wanted to choose manually and select fields that way, this would build SQL for you in that sense and then execute and bring back your result set. So you have the similar capabilities in the right click on data sets to start taking action on your data. And then if you were, say, documenting this database, you have the ability to share, say, the data model in an ER file, right? So all of these are shareable, savable Aqua Data Studio files. Here, a file save as would save an ER diagram as a .xed file. Here, the Query Builder can be saved as a Query Builder file and a QBW file. And then another area that's very beneficial for examining the data that might be a little more analyst focused, but always an area to introduce to Aqua Data Studio users is the visual analytics, right? And so here under the visual analytics new, I could open up a new visual analytics window. Or if I wanted to bring an existing data set into the visual analytics, here is that icon with the bar graph and the visualization icon. So here I could click on this icon and bring my data into visual analytics and then start building worksheets and dashboards, right? Where maybe if I wanted to see a grouping of, say, all records by last name, I have easy drag and drop ways of doing that, or sorting these in different ways and then start performing or building a story with my data set. So these are areas that are beneficial to all users of Aqua Data Studio. And then depending on your role, if you're a little more advanced or developer-centric, you have advanced features like debugging code or stepping into, say, stored procedures. So those are advanced features that some of us might be familiar with. And the navigation tree would introduce some of those advanced features. I could step into a stored procedure and debug or compile. Right-click features for scripting are very popular and easy to find throughout the navigation tree. And then as a mature tool, it's always helpful to have an online wiki for documentation. And so help online, you have the ability to search any keywords, see what's new in that release, and really help yourself in terms of getting better with using Aqua Data Studio. Okay, thank you for joining, and good luck with your RAD Studio, Aqua Data Studio license.
Okay, thank you, Devon. And now I'm going to demonstrate how we can take data from our database and translate it through to a REST endpoint for our web developers to consume. Now, in the interest of brevity, I am assuming a certain amount of familiarity with RAD Studio and RAD Server already. If that doesn't apply to you, I'm sure you'll still be able to follow along, and I will link to some resources to get you up to speed with RAD Studio and RAD Server at the end of this webinar. Okay, so we've been given a ordering system database by our database developer or DBA, and our web developers want to build a web front end for the ordering system. And so we've been handed these two queries that the web guys need turning into a REST API, and we're going to use RAD Server to translate these two select statements into a REST API that they can call. And so we have a username and password, and this database happens to be a MySQL database. I have my IDE already configured to access a MySQL database. For more information on that, check my blog at the community site. But we're going to go ahead and get started building our RAD Server module. So I'm going to select File, New, Other, and I'm going to come down under Delphi here and select RAD Server Package. Okay, so I'm going to create a package with a resource, and that resource will be the ordering system. So we'll call the resource orders, and I'm going to build this on a data module so that I can drop database components onto that module. So I click on Finish, and here's our module. And we first need to set up a connection to the database. So I'm going to go ahead and get a FireDAC connection component and put that on my form. And then I'm going to double click it to use the wizard to configure it. I'm going to select the MySQL database driver here. And then I need to give the database name. Well, our database is named DB Ordering. And we need a username. Our username is web service. And a password, again, web service. Okay, so our server is actually running locally on my development machine here. This could be a remote server, so set this according to where the server is. And I'm going to go ahead and hit test and make sure I can connect. And I can connect to the database, so that's good news. So I now have a connection to our data. I'm going to go ahead and set that to true. And I'm also going to turn off this login prompt option. This is useful for UI applications if you want a login dialog, but this is a non-visual server application. And then I'm going to start building out our queries. So I'm going to drop on an FD query component here, And I'm actually going to do that twice, fd query. So we have fd query 1 and 2. So let's go ahead and start by naming these components as something useful. I'm going to rename the fd connection 1 as simply connection. So this first query is the query to look up all orders in the database. So I'm going to name that all order query. Let's find the name here. All orders query. And I'm going to set the SQL from the select statement that I was given. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste that in. This is effectively going to look through all of the line items in our database and associate them back to orders and then associate those back to customers. So that's what those joins are doing. So this is going to give us all orders with the customer that ordered in one SQL statement. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then the second query, well, this is just going to be a single order specified by ID. So this is going to be the order query. And I'm going to go ahead and copy the code in for that one as well. Okay, and because this is selecting a specific order, this query actually has a parameter, :order num. So that's the parameter that we're going to have to provide to this query in order to look up the order. So let's go ahead now and take a look at the code for this. Well, we only have two get methods here. So we're going to do a get all orders and a get item, so get a specific order. And so let's go ahead and build the first of these two methods. You can see here the sample code returns as the response body a JSON string. Well, we're going to replace that JSON string with an array of JSON objects. So let's go ahead and tear this out and start building out our first method. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to need is an array of objects to return. So we're going to have orders, and that's going to be a tJSON array. And that's going to contain all of the orders that we get back from our query. But in order to build that array, we're going to have to build individual order items and add them to the array. So I'm going to add another order parameter, and this will be a tJSON. And this will be a tJSON object. Okay, so the first thing we need to do, of course, is execute our query. So we'll make sure that our connection is set to connected. Connected is true. And then we're going to do all orders query.active and set this to true. So this is the query that's going to query for all orders query active true. And then we're going to start building our orders array based on the results, assuming that comes back true. If that comes back false, actually, we should probably return an empty array. So let's do that. Let's create an orders array. And at the moment that array is empty, so we'll say if not all orders query active, if not all orders query active, then begin. And we're going to return with a response body set value orders true. The true here indicating that the orders object should be disposed by the EMS server, so we don't have to worry about disposing it. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit exit here, and that will exit our method early if we have nothing to return. Otherwise, we're going to loop through all of the orders. So we're going to do all orders query dot end of file. And just to make sure we're on the first order, all orders query dot first. So this means that we're on the first order in our result set, and we're going to loop through them until we hit the end of the orders. So to make sure that we don't enter into an infinite loop, all orders query dot next. So that's going to ensure that our query continues progressing forward. Now for each item in the database, we want to create an order object. So we're going to create this order object here, and then add that order object to our orders array. So I'm going to start by creating the object. Order is tJSON object.create. Order.addPair. Now the first pair that we're going to add is the order number. So we'll give it a name of order number, and then we're going to pass that out. That's actually a tJSON number, so we'll add tJSON number dot create, and this takes a value parameter. Well, the value is the order number field, so all orders query field by name, and the order number field, and we want to get that field as a float to pass back into the create statement there, and that's our first field. We're going to add another field here. This is going to be the customer name. Now the customer name is obviously a string, and add pair by default will take a string. We don't need to do tJSON string.create. So we're going to go ahead and just add a straight string here. All orders query.field by name will take the first name as string. We'll insert a space, and then I'm going to go copy paste this, and we'll add the last name. Okay, so that's our first and last name being added together as one customer name field. And the other piece of information that we can get from our query here appears to be, yes, the total price. Actually, we need the customer email, so we'll do that first. Customer email, and again, we can copy paste some of this. So the string value that we want is the email field. Order add pair, and we're going to pass back the total value of the order. So because this is a number, we do need to generate this as a pair. We're going to do tJSON. Do I need to do tJSON pair create? No, I don't. We're just adding a pair here. So okay, I'm going to go ahead and add in order total tJSON number dot create, and the number that we're going to create will be all orders query field by name total price, and again we're getting this field as a float, and that's our final pair. Why does it not like as float? Field by name total price all orders query. Okay, I keep missing the S. Okay, so that's our last field. So before we move on to the next query, let's go ahead and test this first method. We actually need to return our order. So we've already put this line in here to return our orders. And we also need to add this order to the orders array. So we'll do orders add order. Okay, so I think that will complete that method. Let's go ahead and save this project. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder here. We'll call it orders endpoint, something like that. Okay, and the first thing that we're saving here, unit 1, is actually our module. So I'm going to save that as mod main, module main actually. And then we're going to save the project itself, which, what do they call it? We'll just call it orders endpoint again. Okay. So we now have a module that we can build. The IDE by default will automatically launch our EMS development server here. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and we get our EMS development server. So I'm going to go ahead and open a browser, and we're going to put in localhost 8080. That's where our development server is running, and we're getting the version string back. But we want to change this to orders. And that's going to give us back JSON data, and as we can see here, we're getting back the order values. Okay, so now what we want to do is to be able to select one of these orders. So let's say order number, I don't know, 28 here, and see the items on the order. And the way we're going to do that is pass in /28, and that will go and look up order 28 in the database. Of course, we need to implement that method before it's going to work. So let's go ahead and shut down our EMS project here and implement this method. So L_item is already the item that's being passed in this case, the number 28, to specify the record that we want. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create an order object. Now this order is actually going to be a tJSON array. No, it's not. It's going to be a tJSON object. So that's going to represent the order. But we're also going to have an items array. So this will represent the individual items listed on the order. And then we'll have an item object, tJSON object. So as we loop through the items in the order, we'll add them to the items array. And the items array will be a member of the order object that we return. So first things first, let's go ahead and make sure we're connected to the database again. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and create our order object, which is our tJSON object. Okay, so there's our object that we're going to return. Now we're going to have to test again that we can connect to our query. So we're going to do order query dot active is true. However, the order query had a parameter, the order number. So we're going to do order query dot params, param by name, and the parameter that we want to set here is going to be order underscore num, and we're going to set this as a string to L item. Now the reason for that is the L item value we're getting here is being extracted from the URL, which is a string, and so we're going to pass it in as string to the parameter. But the parameter is a numeric parameter, so the conversion is going to be done for us by the query component. It's going to convert that string to a number. We may get an exception raised here if the item on the URL is not actually a number. But in our case, it will be, and so we're going to go ahead and proceed here. We're going to set order query to active. Now, if not order query dot active, then begin. We're going to go ahead and return an empty object as we did before. I'm going to borrow 2 lines of code that we wrote previously. But instead of returning orders, we're going to return the one empty order object. So that'll tell us that something went wrong with our query. Okay, so we're going to add a couple of things to order. The first thing we're going to add to order is going to be name. So this is going to be the name of our customer again. And actually, again, I can borrow the first name, last name stuff here. All we need to do is change the name of the query because we're now operating against the order query. But the field names are the same, so we'll get first name, last name, and pass that back as the first thing in our order. The next thing in our order is going to be the email address of the customer. Again, we can do a bit of copy pasting here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy in the customer's email from the email field. Okay, and then what we want to do is loop through and add the items to our order. Now the first thing I'm going to do here is add the, should I do it first or last? I'll do it last. Basically, we're going to add the items array to the order. So I'm going to create the items array, which is going to be tJSON object create. Actually, this is a tJSON array create. So it's going to create an array of objects in the order. We're going to use a repeat until our orders, what's our order query? Order query.eof, so end of file, the end of the array. We want to make sure we don't have an infinite loop on that, so we'll do order query.next. And actually, I'll also ensure that we're on the first entry in the result set. Okay, so we're going to repeat through the result set again. For each one, we're going to create an individual item, which is a tJSON object. And then we just need to start adding pairs to this object. So we're going to do item.addPair. And the first pair that we're going to add is going to be a name value, but this is not the name of the customer. This is the name of the item on the order. So we're going to go order query field by name, and we want the product name field to come back as a string. Okay, we're going to do item add pair, and the next thing that I'm going to put in here will be the color of the item that was ordered. So we're going to say that there are variant colors, I guess, in the ordering system. Order query field by name, and this is going to be product color. And again, this is our string. Okay, item.addPair. And what we're going to add here is going to be the price of the item on the order. So we'll have Json number.create. And the number is going to be our order query field by name. And the field we want is product price from that query as float. So we get that as a floating point value. Okay, item add pair. The next thing we want is the quantity. How many did they order? Okay, so we're going to put in a quantity field. This is also going to be a JSON number, so I'm actually going to just go ahead and borrow this. And this is going to be order quantity, and this is an integer field. So it's a single integer numeric field. And finally, we have an object description. Add pair, description, and we're going to get this little piece here and change the field for product description. Okay, so we have our project description. We then need to add this item to the items array. So each of the items that was ordered on this order gets added to an array of items. And then the items array itself needs to be added to the order. So order dot, we're going to add pair, and the pair will be item. Items, because it's an array, and we'll pass in the items array as the value for that pair. And then we're going to return our response body again. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this. Whoops. And that's returning our response body. So now if I haven't made an error in my typing here, we should have a method which will return an individual item. So again, I start up the server, open up my browser here, and actually I can just come back to this query and refresh 28. And we get an order made by Richard Long, Richard's email address, and a list of items. He's got 4 items here. The first item is the Clark Inspiration Corporation Jiping Steel. These appear to be components of something that he's ordering, and each of them has a color field, a price, and a quantity. So what we've done now is we've fulfilled the request to turn those 2 SQL statements into a REST endpoint. So now we can take our built module, hand that over to our infrastructure guys to install in our web server, and our web developers can go ahead and access that for its data. Okay, so now let's hand over to Ron, who's going to show us how to build a web front end for our endpoint.
Welcome. I'm glad you're with us. I am Ron Bailey. I'm a sales engineer for Sencha, specializing in Ext JS. Here's the goal. This is going to be a live demonstration, so what I'm going to do is provide the finished version of what it is I'm going to be doing. In case somehow it crashes and burns here, you'll be able to examine it yourself. It's in a fiddle, which is an easy way for you guys to jump in and get familiar with Ext.js on your own and play around with it. And as soon as I find the chat window to pass the URL, give me a second here. I had it earlier. Nope, that's not it. Where'd you go? There it is. So you should be able to open up the finished version of this and play around with it as I'm discussing what I'm going to build from scratch. All right, so let me know if that doesn't work out. I'll be happy to fix that. All right, so here's the plan. I'm starting with a brand new fiddle here. So you can go to that same address, fiddle.sencha.com, to create your own or work with existing fiddles. The benefit of this, obviously, is you don't have to have a specialized setup on your own system before working with Ext.js. You can just play around with an environment already provided for you in the browser. Plus, you can share this with other developers, get their input, get their contribution, and it's an easy way to collaborate without having to worry about the minutiae of a setup. So to take advantage of the full features of the fiddle, I'm going to go ahead and create a name for my fiddle. So I'll call this fiddle stack demo XJS. Skip the other details there that you would normally want to actually populate. And by default, what a fiddle will do is provide an environment in the latest version of XJS with what we call the modern toolkit using the preferred theme of that toolkit. So toolkit just means the version of XJS that runs in a particular version of browsers. So we have two toolkits. We have the classic toolkit for legacy applications, and we have the modern toolkit for HTML5 enabled browsers. XJS, you may recall, is a JavaScript framework that specializes in web. Let me get rid of this. Sorry, it specializes in web JavaScript applications. Let me shut some of this down. All right. So the expectation when we run this is that we have a simple dialog in XJS provided for you here, and this is just a dialog that opens up like an alert. It cancels out everything else around it. And you have a title here, and you have some content and a way to close that dialog. So I'll close out of that. And the setup that we have here is a minimal setup, but it would be the one expected from any default XJS project. I've included in the data section what the expected endpoints would be. So let me just, it's named currently. And I've pasted that in now that we have that available to us. And it's just a simple series of objects around the customer details. So the order number, the customer name, customer email, and order detail. It's a JSON file, which is a common data interchange format on the web. It's actually preferred for that matter. And so what we're going to do is we're going to consume and overwrite what was there as the XJS app that ran by default and create the app that we're going to be working on. Showing you the finished version of that is simply going to be taking that data in this preview panel here. We're going to be taking that information and populating it into a grid, providing particular styles for it, formatting our columns to make sure that they read well the way that we want. And if we want, being able to format the data in a certain way as well. So we'll actually do a couple of tweaks here so that we don't have 254.1000. We just have 254. If I want to find out any more information about a particular record inside this set, I'll just click on this, and this dialog will now appear with a title corresponding to their email address, and parsing the customer name to only show their first name, and remove that leading values on the order total, like we see here, and formatting it with red text and italicizing it, or whatever you might want to do. Okay, so that should do for today, and we'll also look through the organization of best practices for how to set up your code. All right, so that's the goal. We'll start from scratch here. Every XJS application by default is a single page application. That means index.html is going to be rewritten for whatever view that you want the user to consume with dynamic JavaScript. So you never use by default, you never use your initial URL provided by the application. So XJS kicks off from index.html. That's the part we'll take for granted for the setup. And much like jQuery, where you have your onReady function, in XJS, you have an ext.application call that kicks everything off. So a method here provided for ext.application is providing a project name and an initial launch just as a default. That's how we got our alert that we saw earlier. We're going to override that with what we want out of our application. So we want to first give our application a name. So we'll say customers. This is actually going to be a namespace, meaning that all our files will be prefixed with whatever it is that we're calling it here. So as I'm building this by hand, by the way, there's plenty of tools to give you templates for this once you understand how all this is set up, but we're doing it from scratch to make it clear what's going on underneath the hood. Instead of a launch, what we'll do here is we'll have what's called the main view property. And the main view property specifies what file is going to be the first ext class that launches as soon as the app runs. So I've said there's going to be a file called mainview.js. The class is called mainview. The file would have the .js extension. So that's what app.js does, is the first call there. Now, because this is not stored at the root of my application, I've nested it a little deeper into a certain kind of organization that I want. I have to provide that in the path that I provide for what main view is here. So I'm going to show you where I've placed that. Every application structure in XJS is provided inside of an app directory. When you want to pertain to the views that you're constructing, like we are here, you place that in a view directory. There are also other directories you can use, like model or store, that we can talk about later. And any particular view that I want to compose, I create a subdirectory here according to that view's name. Now, the reason why you create a subdirectory for it is because you may have needs for supporting details about how this view is composed or constructed, and you may want to have those in separate files. So much in the spirit of web components that's currently sweeping the web, this provides for being able to do that. So one of the ways that you can split this up is by having a main view.js file, which we're about to build in a second here, and then all the details about the view-specific issues, UI styling, widths, layout, et cetera, that would stay in your view. And then any supporting information about that, like whatever data is being supplied to it, you might place in a separate document inside the main view, inside the main subdirectory. And any information about any kind of logic or details about event handlers that you might have, that would be placed in a supporting document inside the main subdirectory as well. So we'll see that contrasted with when you don't need that, where you place other files that might also be brought into your main view. All right, so XJS is written in a class-based type system, in the class spirit. So for you Java heads out there, don't use every rule that you may find in terms of what will and won't work in XJS, but quite a few do. Classes are extendable, which means that you can have your file piggyback on functionality that's already been defined in other classes, and they can be extended and they can be separated and refactored to be able to have teams take advantage of having created those files. So that's what we'll do first with main view here. Actually, I'm sorry, I skipped a step here. Let's go back to app.js so we don't have an issue later. So because I stored that main view file inside of the app directory, inside of view, inside of main, app is going to map to our namespace that we call customers. So I have to provide that as the beginning of the path to where that file can be found. And then from there, the subdirectories of view and main are included in that name as well. Ultimately, what we're doing when we're working with XJS is we're creating a JavaScript build of all files that are necessary in order for the app to run in the browser. So while we're in the development environment, we need to communicate what files need to be part of that build. So since we just pointed to main view as being the launching file here, I am going to specify that that file is required to be part of the build. So I'm going to say requires, and it might be multiple files, so we'll put that into an array. Excuse me for just a second. And then I'll just place that file in that array. It's easier just to use copy and paste. All right, so now that file is ready to go for calling that file and being able to make it part of the build. If you don't do that, you'll get an error that will tell you that that hasn't been done yet. All right, so I'm going to go to mainview.js now and define that. So when you define your classes, there's two main arguments. There is the name of the class itself, the definition of it, and then an options object of a series of key value pairs that say what you want out of that class. And then there's a way to instantiate that class and bring it into another class if so needed. So I'm going to close this up. And then the first key value pair provided here is the fact that I'm extending from a class called ext.panel. Now, we have very robust documentation for any of these classes that you may want to use. So just some sampling there of a couple of classes we will be using, like dialog. I could bring up a panel as well for what features you may use for it and what kind of key value pairs you may need to get what you want out of that class. So by using a panel in particular, I can take advantage of using features like a title. Oops. So I'll specify that I want the title just be something simple like customers as well. And I want a very simple layout for how all the objects I'm going to have in my view might be arranged. That way it would make rendering it to the browser a lot simpler, which means it'll do less work, which means it'll run faster. So there's a layout system in XJS called fit for that. It's essentially the shrink wrap of layout. It just means the simplest means to display one child inside of a parent container is what we want to use. And then for detailing those children, I can create what's called an items array. And an items array will detail all the instances of children that might be coming from a separate class that I want to include in my view. So as a placeholder, just to get started until we're sure everything is working out the way that we want, excuse me, I'm going to just say that I want some HTML placeholder content. So in that HTML, I can actually use HTML. So I'm going to say in the heading 1 that I want to say a grid will go here. And that will allow me to see just that HTML and just that title in the preview window here off to the side if I've done everything here right so far. If not, this is the level at which you want to make an error, so it's simplest to override that and change things for what they need to be. So far so good. In my preview window, I have a panel container here with a title of customers and a body of content that says a grid will go here as a placeholder. But what I want that placeholder to be replaced by is an instance of a component that I want to use to consume that data. So since that's not part of this, what we call a view package for main that we have here, outside of that, I'm going to create a new JavaScript file. That's also going to be a class, and I'm going to call that grid view. As you guys might imagine, you want to be as descriptive as you can for what these files are doing because there's going to be so many of them interacting. You want your code to be as self-documenting as possible. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did for main view and define a class for what I want out of a grid. So my first argument is, again, the path to where the file can be found. Notice it's customers.view.grid because I stored it at the view level inside of my application. I'm extending from the grid class. It means it's going to do everything that a grid will allow me to do, like have rows and columns, headers for those columns, et cetera, et cetera. I have a new piece I've added here called an alias. And aliasing just is essentially as close to the idea of instantiation as you may already know from other programming environments. I'm composing a class here. I want a keyword that's going to allow me to bring this class's functionality live in memory into another class or another file. So I'm going to deliberately change this to be something different, like grid view, lowercase here for the alias I'm going to use, and uppercase for the name of the class itself. Alias is a syntax that you use if you're instantiating a non-UI component widget class, but you can use it for any class that you want. There's a separate aliasing system for if you're using an actual UI component that we'll show you in a minute. But when you're composing your aliases, you provide a widget for the kind of content that it is. So this is a UI widget. We're prefixing it with widget. Later on, we'll see how we can alias other types of functionality that we want, and we'll have a different prefix for those aliases. All right, so now that I have that in place, I want to provide some sort of functionality that I'll be able to see and recognize once the grid has been brought into my main file. So the children for a grid view could be specified with a columns array as opposed to the items array we saw before, a special kind of child. And that happens for other component types that we have too. So the child, the items array for a tab component is going to be a series of tabs. So you specialize in your children in that manner. So we're just going to put one column in here at first to start, again with placeholder content, so that we can, if we run into errors, we know at what level we're at. So it's not a hard search to find what we're looking for. And for the header of that column, we're just going to use the text config. Config just stands for configuration. Whenever we specify a specific key value pair for a feature that we want out of a UI component, then we call that a config by convention. So I'll just name the first header I expect to see here. So I'll say order number. And by that alias, I want to make sure that I can bring that in okay. So I'll go back to my main view. And the first thing I need to do is replace my HTML and my content there with that syntax I mentioned before. Xtype is aliasing for UI components. And the assignment I gave was grid view. So by assigning that as what I wanted to bring in from the grid, anything the grid has now will be seen by the main view. However, because that needs to be part of the build, I need to make sure that I add the file that I'm using inside that requires array. Remember, these are all key value pairs, so an easy error to make is for forgetting your commas when you use these key value pairs. So I'm going to go to grid view and get its path again. All right. So with that in place, this should give me just one simple column in a grid replacing a grid will go here. And there we have it. So right now that's not sized too well by default. So what I can do now is I can create other objects that I want to use. Just a little formatting for visually replicating what goes where. Oops. It's actually the wrong one. Give me a second here. That's right. I need this actually here. There we go. All right. So we'll do a couple of things here. I want the text to reflect these three headers. So let's put text for each one of these. I'm in the fiddle, so I don't have all the advantages of a full IDE would give me. Thank you for your patience on that. And since they're header names, they can just be strings, means I can have the spaces inside of there. All right, so I know by running these now, I'm going to get the same issue with the formatting. So there's tweaks I can make to my grid, unless my syntax is wrong. Object, column. Give me just a second here. Make sure I called everything right. Oh, I don't know where that went. Give me a second. All right. There we go. So we have our four headers here. Let's tweak these to get them formatted. Now remember, everything's coming in from what I want from that grid. So going back to the grid composition itself, there's some formatting I can do for this to lay out a little bit better. So I'm going to do that next. So first I'm going to add some relative sizing with a flex config. And I'm going to say that the first column is going to be half the size of the second and third column. And the third column, I'm just going to say is going to have a fixed width of a certain amount of pixels. Let's say 140. All right, so that makes it look a little bit better there. Still some issues on the first one I could spend time tweaking if I wanted to. All right, so with all that set up, what I really want is for these columns to be populated with the data coming from the JSON file that came from the endpoints generated from the previous exercises API. So we need to be able to bring this data in and make it available to our application. And then once it's available to the application, I can find a way to what we call bind that data to a property of the instance of this grid. So since I want to deal with just managing data right now, I want to create a file dedicated to that to support our main class view here, our main view, I should say. So I'm going to create a JavaScript file called the same as the original file. So since I'm modeling the data for my main view, I'm going to call my file main view model. Did I spell it right? .js. And the definition of that will be the same as we've been doing. A definition argument, and then extending from a class that knows how to manage data for a view. So it's a view model class from ext. And we're going to alias that into the main view by the keyword we're giving it here. So again, I'll close this up so I don't have any syntax issues later. And a property of a view model that I can take advantage of is called a store. And the store is a way that we can collect records that would populate a particular view. So that's stored in object syntax. So any stores I want available to this application, either local to this view or retrieved in some dynamic fashion, I can refer to here. So I'm going to call my store customers. That I plan to bring in from my data set that I have there. So with my store, one of the things I can specify is what kind of store it is. So there's different kinds of store functionality in XJS. One in particular that is of interest is a change store. It's an advanced concept that lets stores be related to each other. We're just going to use a generic store here. I could have left this out as being the default, but you should know about different types of stores. And then I can say that I want that data, once I've retrieved it, to automatically populate and be seen inside the view. That's a config called autoload of true. I could have said autoload of false or just not put autoload at all. And then the idea is that you would have some other means by having that data being shown, like clicking on a button or changing a tab or whatever the case might be. It's up to you how you want to have that data be loaded in, or be displayed, I should say. And then where the data is coming from can be provided with a proxy config. So with proxy, I'm saying my type here is going to be AJAX. I'm making AJAX calls across the network within presumably the same domain, unless I specify otherwise, for where I'm retrieving that data from. And then with a URL config, I'm saying what the path to that data, where it can be found. So with URL, I'm basically just going to say orders.json, because the way the fiddle is set up is anything in the data section of your fiddle is going to be where you can have placeholder data set up for yourself in the proxy. Now, this could have just as very well been an HTTP call across the network going to wherever you needed to, api.mycompany.com, and then specified with URL parameters what you want to be the case, having to do it dynamically. It can take those in as well. But for now, we're just testing how you want to render that data in. So orders.json is the order of the day. All right, so that's how we're bringing our data in. I'm also going to provide a sorter on this. There's all kinds of sophisticated sorters and filtering that you can do inside of XJS with your data once you retrieve it. Let's see here. So sorters. And you can have several sorters, so you're provided with array syntax. And I'm going to say order number is how I want to sort. And as soon as we get the data in here, I'm going to speed up a little bit with the rest of the application. So now that we have that set up, how do we...
Ron?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're already at the top of the hour, or past the top of the hour. Hopefully you can wrap this up pretty quick so we have time for Q&A.
Yep, absolutely. So I got a couple more steps just to show the data being showed in the view. And then while they're doing Q&A, I can show the dynamic part. So all right, so on the grid view, let's just do copy and paste now. I can bind that data with a bind config on the instance. So that's what I've done here. I've said the store of the instance of grid view will be bound to the customer store that I just created. I'll need to alias that store in. So with the view model config, I can do that. So you saw that put in place by hand. That's just a way to say that I'm bringing in that view model. And then I want to have that be part of the build. So I need to provide that path to the requires array. And that should be enough for us to render that data inside the view. Giving it a minute, or if I didn't have any syntax errors. Let's see here. Give me just a second on that. It may take a while to render for the data.
Should we go ahead and start Q&A while you're waiting on that?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in the question panel. There already are a few in here that we've got queued up, and we'll do our best to get them answered for you. And then Ron can break in here and show some additional things as it goes along, and also answer questions. Unfortunately, Craig had to drop off. He had another meeting, a presentation scheduled, and he's gone. But he did leave a note for me that about the some of the questions he had around freeing objects. Let's see. He says he kind of confused the answer he gave in the window, but he mentioned briefly in the webinar that the response set value method takes a Boolean parameter that when set to true, the server frees the objects he passes to it. This is because if you free the objects before the server has sent it in response, you'll get an error delivered to the client. So because that's set to true, it's automatically freeing those for him. All the objects that are created in my demo are parented to the object that was passed in set value, so they will be disposed automatically. If you create objects which are not part of the response, you should free them as a best practice using the .disposeOf method. .disposeOf is cross-platform safe way to dispose of objects, which works on both 10.2, which had reference counting for Linux targets at Apache, and 10.3, which removed the ARC on Linux, and also supports Windows as well. So that was answer to that question here. Devin, there was a question here about Interbase in Aqua Data Studio. Can you address working with Interbase on Aqua Data Studio?
Yes, it will be here soon. I've replied to the chat box. That will be supported in version 20 to late spring, middle half of the year. So look for that support soon for Interbase and more information on that.
Fantastic. Now, it seems like I heard that you can connect to Interbase with ODBC drivers now. Is that right?
There's generic JDBC and generic ODBC. So those would work, but not full functionality of the product. So that will be added with the full JDBC driver in version 20.
Okay, fantastic. That's exciting. Aqua Data Studio is a great database tool.
It is, and it pays for itself rather quickly with the time saving. So hopefully everybody will dive in and benefit.
Let's see. There was the comments here about not having links to past webinars replays. I looked into it. GoToWebinar is supposed to be sending those out, but apparently it's not. So I put the links in the chat window there, so hopefully you should be able to get access to all those. And you get a follow-up email with a replay for this as well. Is it possible, this was to Craig, is it possible to connect to other resources in the same FD connection as in the sample? Craig said yes, just add another query to the same connection. Lawrence says, I currently use DataSnap REST over IIS. Is there any advantages to switching RAD server or drawbacks? So before I read Craig's response, RAD server includes a lot of built-in functionality that you can certainly replicate with DataSnap and REST. So you can look at that functionality and decide. The functionality includes out-of-the-box authentication, user management, server-side analytics, and such. So if you've already got that implemented, then stick with what you got. If you're like, oh my goodness, I so need server analytics, then consider switching to RAD server. Just know that you, of course, would have to port your project over. Where are we at, Ron? You got some more stuff you want to show?
Yeah, actually, how are we doing on questions? I can just basically talk through the finished version, just so nobody has to watch me do error handling there. So where we took it from where we were just a minute ago is to have these columns populated by the data that you got from the data set. So the view model was responsible for that. And then when I want to address anything interactive that I want to do or responding to any kind of lifecycle methods or any kind of event handlers, I can add a controller file. And that's what's been done here. The same way that I added the view model file. It's basically aliased into main view to abstract those features away from the main view. Add it to your requires array. Add the aliasing of the functionality. And therefore, we can add a listeners config to that instance of the grid to say that we want to listen to the select event. And I'm saying that show record is how I want to respond to the select event. In the main controller is where show record is defined. And that's where I can use this method to basically create a dialog, have the dialog have a couple of settings to it just for how it looks by default. So, for example, I could... let's see here briefly.
Devin, there's another question for you here. You can be getting ready here while Ron's working on that. It says, can Aqua Data do debugging or tracing like Microsoft Management Studio can on Microsoft SQL Server?
It can. Yeah, there's debugging support for the major platforms. So SQL Server would be included, DB2, Oracle, Sybase. So the database platforms that have provided a debugging API, Aqua Data Studio supports, so SQL Server included.
And ADS is written in Java?
Correct. So install Windows or a Mac.
In version 20, will the debugging support work on Interbase?
No. I wouldn't think so, but I have yet to see that. But it would depend on what Interbase provides or what we provide. So I'd have to follow up on that. I haven't quite seen the full functionality, but I don't think it would have debugging in the first release.
Okay. Ron?
Yeah, so briefly, all I'm showing you here, some stuff I commented out to make it a little bit clear, is show record here is responding to that select event we saw in the main view. And then to simply dynamically create a dialog, ext.create is how you instantiate a class immediately. So this is instantiating ext.dialog as opposed to the ext.define we had for defining a class. And there's some properties of a dialog that we want immediately to be the case when we first show it. So by clicking on any one of these records, I'm just getting a default blank, certainly sized dialog with a couple of conditions to it, a width and a height, and a height, and the fact that it's closable. Then when I want intelligent information about what is populating that dialog, here I've just mined the fact that when you respond to the select event, you're passing the grid and the particular record that you clicked on to that event handler. And so you have control over the information inside that record. I've mined that with some tweaks here to retrieve from the orders.json field of customer name, which includes both names, just to capture just the first name to put in that dialog box, and to capture the total in the email as well. And then the reason why I've done that is because you can create in a data config any values that you want to be able to manipulate with what's called a template. And it's the template that took those values that I want to manipulate, the first name value that I retrieved and the total. And I can do things with it like use EXT's util formatting series for numbers like I've done here. So by taking this 0 off here, it will include integers and not floating numbers. And traditional CSS can be used around bolding the value that I have for a particular value as well. So it's done that with making it red and making it italic. So now what should be populated with those uncommented, actually this one too, is the trailing number left off and having this be in red and bold, and the email populating the title of the dialog box itself. Okay, and so that basic pattern that you see here is 75 easily to 80% of what you do in XJS. You just do it with more views, and if a view requires to have its data and its logic be abstracted away from the main view itself, like we just saw here, which is the best practice, you just have multiple views in your view directory.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Ron. There's a couple questions here for you. Is it possible to create a Marshal unmarshal function to automatically guess just the field values with REST JSON instead of writing each static field by name dot as string? Or maybe this is not for you. Maybe this is for Craig.
It doesn't sound like it's for me.
Yeah. I saw REST in there and thought it was for you. But I think that was for Craig. I believe, yes, Fabian, there is a way to do that. I'm not positive offhand. You might drop Craig an email and ask him for sure. This one is for you, though, Ron.
I'm glad you mentioned that, though, because I should have mentioned when we were going through the proxy that you could have had REST as a proxy. And if you do that, then it'll honor the call types that you have when you're doing CRUD operations with REST. That will work.
Oh, fantastic. So Alf's asking about authentication methods that you can use with XJS, like authenticating his domain server, etc. Is there a webinar that planned around that, or is there a webinar recently that he can go back and watch, or some resources on that?
I don't know if it's authentication per se, but I know we have some login application proof of concepts types. So if by authentication you mean linking up to like Passport or OAuth or something like that, that is something that is loosely coupled with XJS. So there's a way to connect to that, but we don't have a proprietary authentication scheme within XJS itself. We try to stay agnostic to those sorts of things. But there is on the website itself a login scenario that talks to a particular login scenario, authentication scenario, I should say.
Okay.
So it plays very well. It plays nicely in that space, if that's what you're getting at. But there's no dedicated authentication routine in XJS. It's just, at the end of the day, it's just JavaScript. Whether you want to write ES6 plus or whether you want to write ES5, all that is possible in XJS and interchangeable as well. At the end of the day, it's being composed and written to the browser. If you want to think of it as transpiling, what you actually receive in the browser is regular JavaScript and HTML and CSS. It just makes it easier to work with it in a large team enterprise application.
Right, yeah. Yeah, JavaScript is kind of becoming more like, well, it's interesting to have WebAssembly coming now because JavaScript's kind of the assembly language of the web. It's like,
right.
Yeah. So
like we know it has to be this, but that doesn't mean we have to work in that.
Exactly. Exactly. Is there a visual designer for Sencha?
Yes, it's called Sencha Architect, which actually has a pretty interesting history because it was only meant to be a prototype tool when it was first debuted about 5 or 6 years ago, and now it's become its own monster where everybody pretty much wants to use it as a full-blown IDE, and it's matured very well in that fashion. So I would look into that if you're looking to be able to like associate a store with a view by dragging that store's reference visually to a builder the likes of which was demonstrated earlier today.
Yeah.
I will mention this though, just to save you time. It is not round robin. So once you've set up what you want out of Architect, and it generates the code for you brilliantly, and it's well written and well formed. And once it's running, if you modify anything about that code at all, it's just a one-way system. So it is meant to help you set up working on a project correctly, but it's not a round robin like, oh, let me use Architect to open up somebody else's ext, and therefore I'll have a visual representation of what they built. It wasn't designed for that.
So you could use it to create a visual representation and then add on to that, but then go back and tweak it again in Architect, or once
you could not go back. So you can tweak it after you've built something visually, but once you tweaked it, it's like I said, it's a one-way system. So you would basically just have to recreate it or open the same project up again in Architect and continue working in it.
Okay.
So it does what it does very well, but if you're thinking of it in terms of, I think that the equivalent people always mention is Dreamweaver. If you're looking for something like that, that's not what it is.
Okay. In XJS, is widget like grids or widget or grid support? Does it support right to left languages?
I believe so. Yes. Right to left. Yes, it does.
Okay. Fantastic.
It does very, very well with internationalization, if that's what you're getting at.
Yes, yeah, internationalization for right-to-left languages, exactly.
Right.
So, Devin, what are the benefits of using Aquafold versus ER Studio? So previously we had ER Studio bundled with Architect, and now we're bundling Aquafold Data Studio. What are the benefits of Aqua Data Studio? What can people look forward to now that that's available?
Well, the ER modeling component of Aqua Data Studio is much lighter weight than ER Studio is. So it's not enterprise modeling. To me, a more accurate description would be data modeling of tables, views, indexes, constraints, but not the full object list that an enterprise tool like ER Studio would handle. But it's very easy to use, supports 40 different database platforms, and has easy documentation and cloning of those object types. So if you need more repository based or user check in and out, those would fall in, say, an ER Studio. But the ER modeling component in Aqua Data Studio is similar to other areas of Aqua Data Studio, easy to use, and may do enough for your requirements, right? Or if you're a user that maybe is not a data modeler but needs to generate data models, that tool would be a good fit, and then provide a lot of the other benefits for developers or other database professionals.
Okay, fantastic. And then Jerry's asking, and I guess this is something for we'll look into, Jerry, is with XJS and RAD Server, how would you manage the X Embarcadero session token securely? I'm not sure if that's something you can address, Ron. Otherwise, we'll look at doing that later. I think that would be more of a Craig question. Or he's suggesting as a future webinar topic.
Take that down as a definite topic for a future webinar, and Craig and I will be happy to collaborate on that.
Okay, I'll add it to the list. Let's see. I think that's it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to answer all the stuff as Craig.
I'm just curious. Were people able to open up the fiddle that I sent? I wanted to make sure there wasn't any kind of restrictions on it if you want to play around with it.
I will double check. I saw that you linked it, but I didn't click on it.
I was wondering if any of the attendants have tried. But maybe not. Okay. If there was, I was going to address it and fix it. So
it looks like it's opening up for me. Welcome to the Sencha Fiddle. So yeah, I think I was able to access it. I don't have any special credentials in my browser right now. So
great. Okay. That way people can take away whatever wasn't discussed in detail.
Can RAD Server be deployed on Linux? Yes, RAD Server can be deployed on Linux. Oh, there's the video. It's ready to go.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up for questions. I did say, however, in my part of the session that I would add some additional resource links, so let me get those up on the screen now for you. Okay, and we're open for questions. Thank you.
Okay, so there are the resource links that Craig provided, or said he's going to provide with more information for you. Ron or Devin, is there anything you want to add? You can put it in the chat window as far as links go for resources for people. Craig said he's going to try and join again real quick.
I'll add the Aquafold site on the chat link reply. But it's just www.aquafold.com, has a lot of videos and content for Aqua Data Studio.
Great.
All right, I flew through my other meeting, so I'm back. If there are any questions for me, let me know, Jim.
So there was a question here that I wasn't quite able to answer, Craig. Is it possible to create a Marshal/unmarshal function to automatically get the field values with REST JSON instead of writing each static field by name .as string?
Yes, there is. In fact, if you are on 10.3, I'm trying to remember if it was 10.3 or 10.3.1, there are actually some added components now that will automatically convert a table straight into a JSON output for you. I'd have to look up some info on that. It's a new feature to me. I've not used it yet, but that exists within the tool now. So yes, you can do that as opposed to writing them out manually. One of the reasons that I've not looked at that feature yet is that prior to it being released by Embarcadero product, I'd written my own equivalent to do the same. And that's an option also, is you can just write a function that you pass a table to and have it pass back your JSON. Now, the one thing that I would say is a concern when doing that is you are exposing the field names from your database, because unless you have some kind of a mapping in there, expose the field names, because that will be the names of the items that go into your API. Not such a big concern if you're covering that API with a front end and your users don't have access to it, but just erring on the side of caution, I don't like to hand out field names to the end user. So
to prevent SQL injection, yeah, I guess that's a good idea. Okay, I think that's it. I think we've gotten through all this here. Thanks for coming back around with us, Craig, and thanks, Ron and Devin, for putting this together and for all that you have done for us today. Thank you.
Sure, anytime. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we will try and make sure you get a replay link for this as well. So take care, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.